This is Elemental Conversations, where leadership isn't just talked about, it's tested. I'm Tyler, your host, helping you lead with your values, push through adversity, roll with change, and make bold decisions. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Instagram, and if you're ready to challenge the status quo, then get ready to let the alchemy of education ignite your passion for learning.
Fire, earth, wind, water. This is the Elemental Educator, and now your host, Tyler Como.
Christopher is the Superintendent of Schools and Chief Education Officer at Foothill School Division in Southern Alberta. In his role, Christopher is committed to ensuring that FSD is a place for all. By focusing on the empowerment and well-being of students, staff, and the broader community, he is a strong advocate for placing education at the center of flourishing communities, a responsibility he holds dearly. Welcome to the Elemental Educator podcast, Chris. It is my pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I look forward to our chat.
And right before I pressed record, we had this great conversation, and we'll see if parts of it come back up. But if not, we're ready for a whole conversation. And I want to start, Chris, with the big question, which is, how did you get to where you are now?
It's a great question. I don't know that my journey into education, into this role, is the typical one. You know, I'm married to a teacher. My wife, Tracy, knew as early as probably 4 or 5 years old that she wanted to be a teacher. I didn't come to education in that way. In fact, I was probably in my early 20s. I had left college and was looking to go back to school. I had worked in the trades for a few years and, learned some lifelong skills there, but wanted to connect to something, I guess, a little bit more passion and purpose that aligned with who I am. And I chose to go back into education primarily because I had a plan to travel to Southeast Asia and teach in Japan or teach in Malaysia, somewhere in Southeast Asia. And of course, that never happened. I did a Bachelor of Ed in teaching English as a second language to prepare myself, but was encouraged by a prof in my bachelor's to pursue a master's degree and decided to try and do that. That's where I met my wife. We fell in love, got married, was encouraged to do a PhD, started teaching in the interim, and developed a curiosity, I guess, for how can I contribute in the next role? So from a teacher, started thinking about, I'm from Montreal, so they have something called a staff council there. So became a staff council chair, moved into a vice principalship, and it's always been driven by the curiosity of how can I contribute to a larger system. I only learned that language in the last 5 or 6 years, but kind of that vision of, okay, well, I understand what this contribution is, what's next? So driven in that sense, but not necessarily to get to that level of superintendent, but to understand how the education process works from a different chair or a different desk, if you will, which eventually led me here out to Alberta in a superintendency.
So what trade were you doing before you got into education?
I've done a few. Small engine mechanics, I'm certified in that. I've done some roofing, I've done some electrical, done some plumbing, certainly not to a red seal level by any stretch, but comfortable enough to do that kind of work around the house and have it certified. I've also worked in restaurants. I've done a whole variety of things, honestly. One of the things I think that's on our website at the school division is I've worked in nearly every role in the system. I started as an education assistant, not actually as a teacher. I've done custodial work. I've been a receptionist in a senior citizens home. Lots of varied experiences that just, I guess, help me understand the larger systemic processes and contributors to a school system. Yeah, I've done a bunch of stuff. Don't regret any of it. At the same time, it all led me to where I am today.
Chris, when I hear you talk about this journey you went on, I hear a lot of service. I hear a lot of acts of service. And it's probably not a surprise that there's a relation between the way that you are in servant leadership styles and transformational leadership styles and the role that you take on within that. And with that, that's going to be a nice transition to our first element where we unpack core values in our segment of grounded moments.
3,
All right.
2, 1.
Rooted in wisdom, driven by purpose. Welcome to Grounded Moments. And to build some momentum here, Chris, we are actually going to play a game.
Okay.
So this game is called Principle or Preference. And the idea here is that I'm going to say a line to you and you have to let me know if it's a principle, meaning it's something everybody should be doing no matter what, or if it's just a preference, meaning it's okay to not do it, but some people might.
Okay.
Rapid fire. So the unfortunate side is we don't have the time to justify the answer. We just roll with it and we see where we go. Are you ready to play?
Ready.
All right. So principle or preference, cameras should be on during every virtual meeting.
Principle.
You should always reply to emails within 24 hours.
Preference.
Leadership means being the first to show up and the last to leave.
Principle.
Everyone should take a full 2-week vacation in the summer.
Absolute principle.
Morning routines are essential for success.
Principle.
You should always finish what you start.
Principle.
Every meeting needs an agenda.
Preference.
It's better to over-communicate than under-communicate.
Yeah, absolutely principle.
And flip-flops are acceptable office footwear in July.
Preference.
There we go. And so that's a fun little way to just get into what we decide is what we value and what we don't value. Now, with that, I want to transition to maybe a bit more of a serious idea on values. And before the show, I asked you to provide me with a quote that resonated with you. And the one that you shared was, "The system is right here in this room. The system is created through the relationships among you, nowhere else." And I'd like to just start with, where did you get this quote from and why did you choose to bring it on the show today?
That's a quote from an MIT professor named Otto Scharmer, and it's from a book called Theory U. And I read that book a couple of years ago, and it had a profound impact on me because it's all about the theory itself is a U-shaped theory that he proposes, and it's all about how do we bring positive emergent change into the world. And that was a quote from the book that really resonated for me because as a system leader, I often will hear, and I remember this in schools and remember doing it, and I still contribute to it at times. So it's a reflective piece. It's easy to point outwards and to say, they should, or the system should, or why did this happen? And that quote really empowers every member of the organization, regardless of role, regardless of hierarchy, to take an active role in shaping that emergent future, and to be empowered. To use their voice. We work in hierarchical systems, whether that's by design or not. In every system, it certainly is structured by the way that legislation sets up education systems. But that doesn't diminish the value that each person brings. And so if we can understand that the system, the culture, the organization is created by the relationships that we have with one another, we are empowered with a choice to contribute and to align our individual purpose with the purpose of the organization in a way that taps into our skills and our passions and do good things, contribute, be positive. There are times for questions about why are we doing the things that we're doing the way we're doing them. But if we spend too much time there, we're not actually, in my humble opinion, taking advantage of the opportunity to create that positive emergent change together. So yeah, that's an impactful quote. I've used it. I send something out every Monday morning called the 5-day forecast, and I have a quote, and I kind of unpack, and what am I reading right now, and, set the tone for the week, if you will. I've used it there. I've talked with our whole teaching team about it at various points as we're doing professional learning, and received some good feedback from it too. But it's an ongoing process. You can't, at least I have not ever been able to say, all right, I'm committed to this and never again shall I, point outwards, right? So it's this reflective piece that I guess keeps me grounded.
Let's go a little further into that. So you talked a little bit about bringing it into the workplace. How does it show up in your workflow? And with that, you mentioned earlier about bringing those values into it, and this quote ties heavily with that. So maybe walk me through and the listeners through how this shows up for you at leadership meetings or in your day-to-day work.
I spend a lot of time not in the office. It's necessary. It's a necessary part of the work to be at the office, to tend to meetings, to work with our board. But, I say the board because those meetings take place at the office. But my preference is to be out in schools talking to people, meeting with our school leaders, vice principals, meeting with our directors, walking through schools, talking with teachers, talking with the office support teams, talking with our EAs, our bus drivers. Because that's where you understand and learn how the system is doing. So that, I guess, focus on professional relationships is a big value for me. I'm a curious person. I'm also a creative person in the sense that I don't necessarily like the status quo. I always want to push us to continuous improvement. And that's a push and pull as well, because sometimes the system is not ready for a change. But I ask a lot of questions, and then I gather that information, I synthesize it, and it gives me, I guess, direction that I then will share back with our leadership team and share back with people in those one-to-one conversations. So, from a value standpoint, I've done some work on this. I think humility is extremely important, and having those conversations helps position you in that way, right? Because the voice of those folks that you're interacting with is as equally as important as the leaders in the organization, because it's that collectivity that creates the system and the organization and the vision for it. So humility, creativity, curiosity, caring and courage, because sometimes the work is not easy. Reference back 2 or 3 years during the pandemic, that was not an easy time in the world. It was not an easy time in public education, but we all had courage to get through it. When I say we all, teachers, parents, students, community at large, we got through it primarily because we relied on one another and created the relationships necessary to get us to today.
And the points you're sharing, the creativity, the curiosity, the humility, these are values that connect really closely with that idea of that servant leadership, that transformational leadership. It's those values that bring a team together and really build that momentum as a group. And it's nice to hear, right, that other people are not just content with status quo and they like to challenge that status quo. One of the first interactions I had in getting into education would have been at university, where I was told to not reinvent the wheel. And I hated that line because sometimes the wheel needed to be reinvented. It needed to look different. But sometimes it was also okay. And as you mentioned, it was good to feel it out for a process and see where it goes. Now, with that, this is a powerful message, Chris, and we've done a pretty good job of expanding into it. Have you heard of an elevator pitch before?
Yes.
So 10 to 20 seconds, this conversation we kind of just had, I want to put you up on the spot for a second, hear your best elevator pitch as to why people need to bring this concept into their practices.
I would say that it's about community. We interact with one another on an ongoing basis. We serve the same purpose, which is the future, which is students. Whether they be our students in our classrooms or from a superintendent standpoint in the system, or the kids of parents out there in our community, we live and work and play in the same places. And so we need to find that positive emergent future together and work towards it so that our community flourishes. That's it. That was probably more than 20 seconds, but not too much.
No, that was awesome. And with community actually is a really strong point, because if you are fighting with your community and you're facing adversity against your community, it's a lot harder of a process to address the problems in the system and the organization and to reinvent that wheel or take a look at the status quo. Mm-hmm. And to face that adversity with a community, you have to put them first. You have to build those good relationships. And that's actually going to lead us to our Air Elemental segment on adversity with headwinds and tailwinds. Through storms and surges, discover the lessons from headwinds and tailwinds, where we focus on the challenges that test us and the forces that help us move forward. Now, to go a bit more personal to your end here, can you share a moment of adversity that you have faced?
Sure. There have been a few. So let me think through this. There was a time during that same pandemic period when every day I would wake up and, I call it hate mail, and I don't think that was the intent of it. I have respect for the divergent perspectives that exist in our community and in any community. Having said that, reading first thing in the morning, contributions that are just disparaging, is probably the best way to put it, day after day after day, was really difficult to try and maintain not necessarily even positive, but a connection to purpose in the work, because it was quite blatant that certain elements of our community were discontent. And that was on either end of the spectrum of perspectives, whether it was we're not doing enough to keep people safe or we're doing too much to keep people safe. People were quite empowered to just speak out and bluntly tell you how they felt and lay it at your feet from a leader perspective, right? And like or not, I'm the public face of the organization, and so they were directing it to the right spot. But it was really, really difficult to maintain purpose in the face of that.
what was the turning point, Chris, where things started to shift from it being so difficult to maybe a bit more manageable to getting out of it?
It was an internal turning point, and understanding that the purpose of leadership work is not to make the entire community happy with every decision, and not that we don't drive towards that. Right? It's important to try and align the voices that we hear with the decisions that we make, but also not to, personalize that. Right? There's a figurehead. That's where that feedback should go, but it's not me as a person that people are directing their angst towards, and coming to terms with that. It took a while. It was a process, but it still isn't pleasant. And I don't think it's pleasant for anyone to receive negative feedback about the work that we do in our systems and in our schools. Having said that, it's an opportunity to reflect and to understand what we could do differently. I call it the gut check. If ever I lose the gut check, I'll retire. Because when feedback comes, positive or negative, when it's positive, I like to deflect that out to the system. When it's negative, I need to reflect on it and understand whether or not there's something we could have done differently, and own that if it's the case that we could have done it differently, and then move forward with change.
And it's a good way to do it as well, is whenever something positive comes your way, to share it with your team around you, because that's going to bring your team up. That's what a leader does, is they are leading leaders as well, and to share the success shows them that humility that we talked about earlier, shows them the transparency that we talked about earlier, and the reflective process on the gut check, right? Same idea. It's showing the humility, it's showing the transparency, it's showing the team that we're human and that we learn as things go, because there's not a single superintendent in the province, in the country, that has navigated that before, and they were all going through it for the first time. Yep. And what did that look like for everyone? And so that would be incredibly difficult. And I think I agree with you to an extent on, in your role, you have to remove the personal from the email or the message that's coming in. But from the person sending it in, sometimes it was made personal because it was your decision and it was your action and it was your fault. And so those are difficult things to flip the switch on and say, hey, this isn't about me. This is about the system. So what was kind of your anchor that helped you stay grounded during that adversity?
I was reading a book called Compassionate Leadership by Rasmus Hugard and Jacqueline Carter. And there was a section in the book that spoke about what is compassion. And compassion is moving from empathy into action. And it was unpacking that and reflecting upon that helped me understand that the actions that I was taking were the right actions to take in the circumstances. It didn't necessarily depersonalize it, because you make a good point. The self and the leader are the same people. So you may manifest more of yourself at home with your family or with people that are closest to you than you would in a professional setting. Having said that, the values that you hold as an individual, like or not, tend to bleed into the work and guide the work of the organization. That separation of it's not about me doesn't necessarily hold true to the extent of the values piece. It holds true from the standpoint of the figurehead of the organization. And if we're comfortable with the things we're doing and we have the ability to change our decisions based on new information, that was kind of a turning point as well in reflecting on compassion into action and staying out of empathy. I shouldn't say staying out of it. Empathy is important, but moving from empathy into action. And how do we change? How do we support? And when I say all of this, it was more, a self-reflective process. It isn't so much about the organization and community. It's more about, this is how I kind of reconciled as an individual. How do I move forward with the work?
Now, somebody that I interviewed a few episodes before this, Tom Buck, when we went through this segment of headwinds and tailwinds, he changed my perspective on the headwinds a bit and said, from the perspective of a pilot, a headwind is a good thing because it lifts you up, and it's not necessarily something in your face that slows you down and pushes you back. So I'm curious, was there a lifting moment from this headwind that you recognized, move forward with, and it's actually changed the way that you're now leading today?
Yeah, there was. And I think it was fully embracing a concept of vulnerability. And what does that look like? And not necessarily to intentionally model it, though there are times where I think that's important, but to embrace it and be that person. Talk about the why, even if it's uncomfortable. Talk about the challenge, even when it's uncomfortable. And the feedback I've received from that is that people connect to the fact that human beings are human, right? People connect to the fact that it's hard, even for an individual sitting, in a superintendent's chair. Some of the work is hard and it takes a toll. And so I guess to sum that up, as I grew as a person, but also as a leader, I think I fell prey to this concept of the leader, the staid, the reserved, the calm, the unstressed. And again, there's a role for that, right? We don't want to panic in the face of a crisis because that sends not a great message to the people who are looking towards you for that calm. But to remain in that space all the time, I think puts too much pressure on a person as an individual and doesn't allow those more vulnerable moments to surface and to say, you know what, this really is hard. And to acknowledge that. And it allows people, and that's feedback I've heard, is it allows people to connect with that and realize I'm not alone in this. It really is difficult, whatever that circumstance may be. And to put much more of an emphasis, I guess, through that on coaching and mentoring of leaders in the system. I don't have formal coaching certification, but I guess kind of through self-reflective questions, helping people and coaching people to come to their conclusions on their own and solve those problems through a supportive and compassionate approach.
And to have the approach of, this is going to be really hard and uncomfortable, but I'm going to give you my best effort to get the best result for us. A simple line like that goes a long way in showing the vulnerability to people. And you'll see the support rally behind that message a lot quicker than somebody that's imposing and imposing and imposing.
Right.
So I'm glad to see that came out. And for people facing their own headwinds, their own adversity, do you have any piece of advice for them to help them keep moving forward and turn that to a tailwind?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. One would be to not rush into a decision. Consider, take time, think through. If you feel an emotion arising, why is that arising? Emotion is natural. It helps us navigate the world. At the same time, following that emotion when it first arises isn't always necessarily the right thing to do. Rising frustration, rising anger might lead to impatience and not taking the time to hear voices, other voices, for example, that can help inform a decision, but also to seek assistance, talk with people. Who are the people in your circle and in your network that you can confide in and talk about challenges with? And through those conversations and that internal conversation, come to a place where you're comfortable with what you're deciding. Like the first principal I worked for, this was probably in 2000, sat me down the first day I came into his school, and he said, Chris, whatever decision you make sure you're comfortable with it. And that has transformed. My understanding of it has transformed over the years because, when I first heard it, I wasn't sure what he meant and, the learning curve of a vice principal moving from teaching to vice principalship. Now I understand it as make sure you're comfortable with it, not because you can defend it, but because you can change it if you have new information, right? Here's why I did what I did, but now knowing this is what I would do differently. That models that vulnerability and that humility, but it also leaves you open to change. Locking yourself in and defending something, at all costs, if you will, is not a winning formula, in my humble opinion.
I completely agree with you as well. And to speak about change, it's a nice segue into our water element and our segment of ripples of change. Small shifts, big waves. This is Ripples of Change, where we dive into the power of embracing change and making waves that last. And we're going to play another game here, Chris. This one is not a fast-paced game. We're going to slow it down a little bit, similar to what we just kind of did, where I'm going to ask a question, and we just want some quick tips of advice within a short, we got about 30 seconds to a minute to give some advice on some of these questions, okay? Okay, so one quick tip for managing a team with strong personalities.
That's a challenging situation. I think one of the first things I would do is take time, sit, listen, try to understand, meet with people individually, get a sense of who they are, why they're advocating for the things they're advocating for, what connects them to that perspective and why it's important to them in advancing the work. And also have conversation there around, how does that connect to our larger purpose as an organization or as a school? And how can we help you make that connection? So learning about the team, learning about what drives people in those one-to-one meetings, observing the dynamics in the group, but not for too long because those dynamics can go a little bit south, and providing coaching for people to bring that passion back to the space of a collective contribution and helping people understand the why, the strength in that personality. but also coaching around voice and listening and empathy for those people around you on the team.
And taking the time to understand, as you mentioned, those strong personalities usually correlate to some strong strengths. And to align those strengths and to create a team that has those unique strengths is something really powerful.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. How do you reset after a bad day as a leader?
I have my own routines on that, and they're not necessarily ones that are going to work for everyone. So the caveat ahead of sharing that routine with you is to encourage people to find what works for them. Who are those people closest to you? Who can you have a conversation with? So in my case, it would be my family. There's a fine line to walk there because we work with a lot of confidential information, but how do you convey that it was a difficult day and why without necessarily breaching confidentiality? There's a lot of power in nature. There's a lot of power in solitude. I spend a lot of time writing and journaling, walking the dogs, getting out. So it's that combination of spending the time necessary to understand what works for you. That could be surrounding yourself with people you love. It could be spending an hour alone, but there's a necessary reset after days like that, and also periods like that, because I find they come in seasons. We have seasons of things go well, and then we have seasons of several challenges arise at the same time. And it's even more important to spend that time resetting on a daily basis when you're in one of those more challenging seasons.
I appreciate that. Now, what's the secret to starting the school year strong?
In my case, I spend a lot of time reading during the summer. I spend a lot of time reading all the time, but I guess the difference and where it connects to your question is understanding what it is I want to advance that school year and coming into it with a vision that connects to the vision of the organization and conveying that, to the folks I work most closely with. In my case, it would be our executive team, our school leadership team, I should say our system leadership team and our trustees, but then messaging that out to the whole system. We're fortunate that we have a nimble enough system that we can bring everyone together at the beginning of the school year. And so setting the tone in that sense and explaining why we're moving in these directions and how it connects. The other piece of that is making sure to take advantage of time to rest and disconnect. I say I spend a lot of time reading. It's a passion of mine. So I don't necessarily consider it work. For those who would, I would recommend that you not read in the summer and really find that deep place of peace and disconnect from work so that you're your best self when you get back at the beginning of the school year.
I bring that back to basics where I say, go into the year with a goal, right? Because if you're just going into it with the mindset of it's another year, it's not going to be a great start. You need to go in with intention, and you need to have intention with everything you're doing.
Yeah.
One more here, Chris. What's your go-to way to build trust quickly with a new group?
Yeah, that's a great question. And getting back to people when you say you will, regardless of the outcome. If you say you're going to act on something, do something about something, connect someone with something, look into something, getting back to people, even if it's an answer they don't necessarily want to hear, but that is the answer, builds a lot of credibility. People see you as reliable. They also see you as human when you can admit, because it happens every now and again when you drop the ball on that. You know what? I dropped the ball on that. So I think the go-to combined with spending time with people and talking with them and building that positive professional relationship and understanding who they are. I think it's a combination of those two things, because when you develop that positive professional relationship, invariably you're going to have to get back to people on things because you're opening the door for them to take those tentative steps of trust. And that's where you have to actually, deliver, put credits in the bank so that when you drop the ball on occasion, those credits come into effect.
Yes, delivering those quick wins of a simple follow through, right? They're so important. And all of these questions have a relation to the idea of change in some way, shape, or form. And with that, Chris, what's a recent change that you've embraced or led?
I'll go back a couple of years, and then it's context for the direct answer to your question. So through some reflection and a lot of voice through our leadership team and a lot of reading and kind of synthesizing all that information. I say this with humility. If I have one skill, it's synthesizing information. And so collecting voice, reading, looking at research, and deciding, well, what is the vision of our organization post-pandemic? Because, there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of challenge globally, and bringing that team back together and defining a purpose moving forward. And so what we came up with or I should say what I came up with synthesizing all of that voice and research, was this concept of community and moving towards a flourishing community where there's interdependence between us, so that, I'm having not such a great day, I can depend on you, Tyler, and vice versa. And flourishing is a state we move in and out of, a constant state. It's not a goal and a checkbox. And defining that for the system. So that's work we've been doing over the last few years. But to answer your question more directly, redefining that most recently with different language. And it's similar but different in that it's more easily accessible. Because I think the vision that I and we set was perhaps too lofty. So now we've redefined it as placing student learning and well-being at the center of a flourishing learning community, which, I don't say this because it's the intent of it. It's more difficult to opt out of that, right? Because we have kids in our buildings every day, kids in our buses every day. And how are we contributing to a positive learning experience and developing a sense of well-being so that they're available to learn? And that's the flourishing learning community we want to develop. So it's been a course adjustment in a sense. That lofty goal of bringing that out to our whole community still exists. But taking a step back to take a few more steps forward to get to that larger goal is something just in the past few months I've started messaging out more with good feedback.
And I sit here and I go, I love that change. I think that's great. Now, implementing it, Chris, often comes down to those two key moments, the first step we take and the final move that makes it stick. And I don't think we're at that final move in the one that you're sharing. What was the first step that you took to initiate this process, and how do you intend to make it stick?
Well, there were a couple of first steps. Like I mentioned before, I send something out every Monday to the whole system. So every employee in the system receives this. And a bit of an aside, we've received some feedback that we probably should share that more widely with our community. So put that aside because we haven't decided how to do that yet. But shifting that language and explaining the why of it in that format so that every employee in every role has access to that information. More specifically, we have a leadership team meeting. We call it a learning day every month, where everyone in a leadership role comes together and we learn together. And every time we come together, I've kind of grown into what's called the superintendent address. And so I speak to what I've learned, what I'm seeing in the system, how it connects to the reading that I'm doing, what the goals are, and really unpacking that with our leadership team in our most recent meeting to connect them back to that larger purpose, but also why the course adjustment and how are we then going to, as a system leadership team, convey that back to our staff teams in our schools. And, it's kind of a two-pronged approach, if you will. The system's hearing it from me, but we're also reinforcing it through the school leadership teams. So what was the second part of your question? Because I think I did not answer that.
With change also often comes the idea that, change won't last or it's a passing trend. So with this change, what are you doing to help make sure it becomes a part of culture?
Yeah, that's the presence piece. As I said, I'm often out in schools, probably 2 to 3 days a week. So it's having those conversations with the folks that I encounter, whatever role they may be in, and reinforcing that and gathering information about, if people are open to sharing it, but what's your role in that? Where do you connect to that? What does that look like? We've done some work at the beginning of the year around shared leadership teams, connecting that to research. So reinforcing that, are you bringing that to your shared leadership team? Where's the space for you to share that voice? How do we connect that passion that you have in advancing that purpose of student well-being and student learning and the flourishing piece, and talking with leaders about that as well. So it's in the moments of conversation and presence and building those positive professional relationships that I do that culture building work.
Very much appreciated there, Chris. And the idea of making it constant and continuous parts of conversation are so important to just keep the message going. And to do that year after year, it will eventually allow it to infuse. And now with those first steps, those are decisions we make, and changing something like this can be considered a risk. And I'm going to use that to segue us to our fire segment and get into spark or burn.
Okay.
Ignite your ideas, face the flames. This is Spark or Burn, where we talk about bold decisions, big risks, and the fires that either spark success or burn lessons into our memory. And Chris, we're going to play one more game for our final element here. This game is called Final Decisions. There's one choice, no regrets. We're just going to lock in an answer of a this or that scenario. Okay? Early bird or night owl?
Early bird.
Lead from the front or lead from behind?
Depends on the moment, but behind overall.
Spontaneous retreat or detailed strategic plan?
Oh, spontaneous.
Ice cream or iced coffee?
Coffee.
Public praise or private feedback?
Private feedback.
Summer school or summer off?
Off.
Read a book or listen to a podcast?
That's a tough one. Probably book.
More meetings or more emails?
Neither. Meetings because people are there.
There we go. I like that answer. Team building or task tackling?
Team building.
And a vision board or a checklist?
Vision board.
And with those tough decisions, Chris, can you tell me about a time when you had to make a bold leadership decision or took a major risk? And what was the spark behind it that made you say, I have to go for this?
Probably moving out here 6 years ago. We made a decision as a family to leave Montreal, and I'd spent my life there with the exception of spending about 8 months in the Jasper area when I was, that story I told earlier about going back to school. It was just before I went back to school that I was out in Jasper. And at the time, it's a logical career goal, if you will. I was, I think the equivalent here in Alberta is called an area director. We called it a regional director. Back in Montreal, in a system of about 25,000 students, family of 16 schools. And, it's a logical decision to move into a superintendency. The feedback that I got, though, and I said before in humility, if I have a skill, it's synthesizing information. If I have a fault, it's missing the obvious. So the feedback that I got at that time was that's really courageous, and I didn't see it that way. 6 years after having made that decision as a family, I understand that courage to move to a new place, to take on a new role, but more importantly, to have your family go through that process along with you. It was probably easiest for me because I was busy, right? I was at work, I was meeting people, I was learning about the organization, the culture, the history, developing a vision. Unfortunately, the world shut down shortly thereafter as well. So, the family that I rely upon was in a position of being in a new place, not really knowing anyone and not able to leave the house for the most part. It's circumstance, right? It would have happened to us in Montreal too. It would have been difficult there too. But reflecting on that, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now 6 years later, that was risky. And it's only now, years later, that we're really settling in, and finding that sense of community within the community we live in. And I will say that there is a deeper sense of community here in the West than in urban Montreal. And we appreciate that and we saw that. But it's taken a while to actually, become part of the fabric and feel comfortable becoming part of the fabric. And that's not a criticism of the people around us. It just is, to answer your question, the risk of, well, this will be great. Yeah, but it was also quite difficult, and probably more so, as I said, for the family than it was for me because I had something to move towards.
And with that, your excitement is probably not the same excitement as those around you, right? You have the excitement of the new job, the role you're coming into,
right?
And your family has the excitement for you, but not the same extent of it's you taking on the job, not them. And the people you're coming in to work with are under the impression of they just have somebody new coming in and they're nervous, they're anxious. Some might be excited, some might be worried, some might be mad. They might want to know what's going on. And you mentioned, around 6 years, you're now starting to feel, a bit more rooted in the community that's around you. Did you have to adjust your strategy along the way to start to really embed yourself in this community?
That's a great question. I'm not sure, to be honest with you, because when you're a teacher and you would hopefully agree with this and understand this, you're always a teacher. When you're a principal, you're always a principal. When you're out in the community, you're not necessarily seen as Chris, you're seen as the superintendent. If people, and I'm not saying I'm any kind of superstar here, but if people are familiar with the system, they'll see you as that person in that role. And so, I'm not sure there was a shift in that sense. I guess maybe to answer your question, finding the friendships and the relationships that saw beyond that. And investing the time in those so that we could be surrounded by a network of people who see us as Tracy and Chris and our kids, and not as a teacher and a superintendent in a school division. That was probably the course adjustment is, understanding that we need to find those people and rely on that, that trusting element that you have with friends and people that are close to you to develop those relationships.
And, you mentioned the word trust here, and that's a big part of it as well. As a leader, an executive leader coming in, a big part of being in the community is going to need to be building trust with that community, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not going to happen within the first year that you move there, and especially not going through a pandemic, because everybody's going to constantly have all these questions around what's the next step.
Yep.
But being consistently there and showing up with the values that you're driven by, I'm bringing it back to our earth element where we talked about your strong presence of servant leadership and transformational leadership. By actioning that over years, you're showing your community that this is you and you're not just a 1-year thing coming in with a face on. There's no mask, right? This is Chris. And the community's at a point now where they've seen that over time, that they can step back and go, okay, now we know this is the real deal. And so that welcoming is always a good sense. And, you're not the first person I've talked to, Chris, that has packed up and moved. I've actually talked to some that have gone Alberta to New Brunswick, all over the place. And, these moves can be very intimidating. Now, without the extreme of an uproot and move, what's one bold action you can dare the audience to take on this week to try to build that decision or risk-taking muscle?
That's a great question. My mind goes to, we all, I think I'm speculating, that we all probably have, moments in conversations or reactions that surface that we're not necessarily able to head off, or someone that we feel we would like to, perhaps get to know better or build a stronger professional relationship with. And I guess my risk-taking tip would be to reach out, to do that work, to pick up the phone and call a colleague and say, hey, you know what, I appreciate the work you do. Can you talk to me more about that? Because I think I've got something to learn from you. Or to pick up the phone and say, hey, I feel like I didn't react the best way possible to that conversation that we had. And I just wanted to tell you that wasn't my best self. And hopefully, our working relationship can become stronger from that. That's hard work, and it's not work we gravitate towards necessarily. And it's work that, I still have work to do on and probably will for the rest of my life. So it's that when you have that impulse of, or I'd like to get to know that person better and I have something to learn, act on it. Take the moment, send the email, the text, or the pick up the phone. Probably pick up the phone is the best option, because having conversation is always the best way to unpack something. So that would be it. Act on those things and take those risks and build that network of people that rely on you and you can rely upon, and that's community. Help out, do what you can.
I love that. And picking up the phone, one of the things that I have prioritized over the last 2 years in leadership is whenever I've gotten a message from whether a parent, a student, a staff member, somebody, I've always wanted to, and I've typed out the email, but then I've sat on it and then I've just called them and we've had the same conversation over the phone. And then I still send the email as a follow-up as to, hey, this was great. Here's what we talked about. And that phone call is so intimidating, and I didn't realize it until I had to do it the first couple of times. But it mitigates and just creates this sense of ease, and that's where the collaborative and the communication comes through, because we can all sit behind a computer and be a keyboard warrior and send things and not understand the tone that somebody's reading it in. To pick it up and actually engage in that conversation is a huge decision to make, and I would encourage anybody, when you're making decisions, to do it through verbal communication rather than necessarily in writing, but save the writing for the follow-up.
Yeah, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. Those are the moments that relationships are strengthened through, whether it be positive or, more of a mea culpa. I'll just put it that way. People remember that, and the kudos that you can offer. I guess that would be an add-on. And I have a practice of when I'm out in schools, I see something positive. I've had postcards printed and I'll write people notes. Hey, I was really impressed with, or thank you for that contribution. Parents, students, staff, but I also put a call out monthly or so to our entire leadership team and say, who could benefit from some kudos, and tell me the why. And the why is important because these postcards get sent out with, I had an opportunity to talk to Tyler recently, and he really highlighted whatever it may be. The way that you led that dramatic performance for all the students and all the time that you dedicated to it. And that's really important, and it has positive impact. And gratitude, gratitude works both ways, right? It makes me feel good for having thanked someone, but it also makes the person receiving that feel like, you know what, that work was recognized. And anyway, I think that would be the other piece. Not that you asked for another piece, but it's important to recognize people and the contributions that they make.
It's a great add-on to throw in there. And alchemists, with that, you asked, and we're going to answer here. This is one of our last segments. We're going to get into listener questions. Okay. And so, Chris, I put it out into the community that, hey, I have a superintendent coming on the show. If you could ask them any question, what would you want to ask them? And I had 2 come in that I want to share. Okay. So I'll read them out and I'll give you some time to maybe address the questions. And then I might throw in my own little spin after to see, and we'll go through the 2 and then we'll probably wrap things up.
Okay.
Okay. So the first one that came in, it says, in your years in a leadership role, what has most surprised you about the educators you work with?
Great question. I guess it's 2 things, if I may. And the first is the limitless amount of time and energy that people are willing to give for students. A lot of that work is unheralded. It's not recognized. It's not seen. That play that I just spoke about, sending someone a thank you for, there's countless hours that people are putting in there to create that opportunity for students. And I've seen that, in my role as education assistant through to the different roles I've played. And it's constant. It's part of the educator ethos. And it's really impressive to see people give so much time to provide opportunity for students. And it creates community. The other is a willingness or an expressed willingness for change, and then a kind of hesitancy to embrace the change when it comes. It's fascinating from a human nature perspective, especially in the role that I'm in now. I see it more so, but I saw it as a principal and a vice principal as well. And you can have a lot of great conversation with educators, and they bring that passion and they see direction and the things they want to bring forward. But then when you move in that direction, there's this almost innate hesitancy of, whoa, wait a minute. And I think, and this isn't necessarily the answer to that hesitancy, but as I've reflected upon that over the years, we spend a lot of time in structure and routine, and these are things that are helpful to us from a teaching and learning perspective, classroom routines and structures and expectations that help us build that learning community. And when we institute change, routines and structures change. And I think that's where that hesitancy comes from, in understanding what my space is now going to be and what is that change going to look like, and will it in fact change those routines and structures, and how. So those would be the 2 things.
I want to add on that. I had Dr. Mark Williams on here a few months ago, and I've got Dr. Greg Wells coming up, and they're both, they both study the brain. And one of the things that Dr. Mark Williams talked about was, the fight, flight, or freeze response. And whenever you're encountering something new, your reptilian brain is constantly cycling to, is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe? And so they've had time in their current setting to process new ideas. But then when that new idea gets actioned, now their brain is going back to, oh, we just did this. Is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe? Right. And they have to get over that hump and recognize that it is safe to then keep moving forward. And so the way the brain works with that always is something that I'm interested in and gets me going to analyze, similar to the point that you made. And I want to jump onto this question as well, because, I haven't been in what I would say is a formal leadership role for a long time. But I'm always surprised with similar to you, the time that an educator will want to put in when they are doing something they're interested in. Mm-hmm. And every time I've had the opportunity to start the year as a leader, I've always said to the staff, we have an opportunity to wipe the slate clean, and we're going to be in the same building. It's going to have the same name. It's going to have the same logo. But what we choose guides us, and what you teach is totally up to you to hit a reset on. And I always just ask them, what do you want? What would you do? And from that has stemmed some really cool ideas. Like this year, we actioned a land-based agriculture program where our kids are going on at least a trip every 2 weeks and constantly reflecting on the process of, what did we learn from harvest, or what did we learn on the trails of Ross Lake while we went out ice fishing, and the stories that they're pulling together from it. we also brought in esports from it. And we also brought in like an in-person green certificate. We took a school bus and converted it to a greenhouse and somehow ended up with an ATCO grant to put solar panels on the side of it.
That's great.
And it all came from, you can do something you want to do. What is it that you want to do? Right. And to hear the ideas and to connect it to the learning. And I think for teachers to see that every idea they had wasn't met with a no or this won't work because, and okay, this could, but here's what you have to do to make it work. The motivation you can draw out of them. It's something really cool to see. So,
Yeah,
similar to you, the time people are willing to put in. Now, I want to jump into the second question that we got in here. And this one is a totally shift to a different topic here. How do you make your teachers feel validated in the shadow of difficult parents?
I think part of the answer to that question, and here's some stream of consciousness, part of the answer to that question is to reinforce the positive teacher practices that are taking place in that classroom. And you know, I spend a lot of time in schools, and as a principal, you probably spend a lot of time in classrooms. And you see evidence of how people are creating that positive learning environment. And so reinforcing that, and also coaching and mentoring around, you know, how do you respond to that challenge? What is the intention? How do you tease out the intention from the fact in the classroom? How do you accompany people through that process? You know, as a principal, for example, I would offer certainly, well, why don't we call back together? You know, those are moments too where you don't necessarily want to get into a chain of email response. Pick up the phone and have the conversation. At the heart of it, in most, I would say, you know, I hesitate to put a number on it, but in a 90 percentile place is someone who feels as though their child has been mistreated in a form or fashion, right? And so tapping into that and, you know, speaking about the dignity of the child and safeguarding that and working together to be able to partner and make sure that child is in a safe space, which we know they are in our classrooms when we're, you know, present, and helping people understand that most of us as educators have children. I had a bellwether moment when our first child was born and I went back to teaching, and I saw the classroom as not a classroom of students, but a classroom of other people's children. And I knew how I felt in the moment my daughter was born, and this, you know, sense of overwhelming love and care comes upon you in that delivery room. That's how I have to choose to believe everyone feels about their kids, right? And so that difficulty comes from a place of, so how do we find a bridge where we can talk about, you know, putting the child at the center and set aside, while addressing disrespect if it exists, because that's important too, and making sure people treat each other respectfully in the interactions that they have. Yeah, that was a stream of consciousness response for you.
That was great. And I actually want to echo something you said, and there's no percentage to put on it, but I would say the majority of parents that are coming in confrontational are scared for their kid. And you chalked it up to they feel their kid is mistreated. And very similar to what I'm saying here is, you know, people don't just typically come in angry out of the blue. Something was shared that made somebody feel not safe. And it's a defense mechanism. And so there's the reassurance on that. You have to, again, as we said, the importance of the verbal conversation, talking on the phone, talking in person, doing it with a team. On the flip side, you know, if we're talking about a parent whose kid was misbehaving, being disrespectful, and you're reaching out for contact and they're saying, that's not my kid, I don't understand it, where are you coming from? That's, you know, again, inviting them in. Hey, come in and let's have a conversation about it. And I do like to include the kids in those conversations to say, this is what I see in my classroom. Can you tell me why? And, you know, more often than not, that conversation, at least in person, ends with parents recognizing that not every child is perfect, but every child makes mistakes. And how do we learn from them and how do we grow from them?
Right.
And you create that better sense of understanding. So listeners, I hope that answered your questions here. And Chris, I have to ask you before we wrap things up fully, what's next? What do you got in store?
Yeah, I'm at the other end of the career spectrum, 3-4 more years perhaps in this role. I've got a book ready to go out to publishing that I'd like to get out there. I've been doing some work with College of Alberta school superintendents, for example, developing courses, consulting a little bit. That's probably where I want to go next, paving the way for that, if you will. pre-retirement plans. I enjoy working with people. I don't think I could work on my own. So, the work at the same time takes its toll over a career, and having an ability to go in and assist without necessarily having the responsibility for it all at the end of the day is something I look forward to, but I'm not there yet. I've got a few good years left in me. Unless, as I said before, I lose that gut check piece, then it's time to exit. But yeah, that's what I see in the future, and just being of assistance is probably where I want to be.
Great message, Chris. And as we get closer to book launch or after book launch, we're going to need to have you back on the show to talk about it, to unpack it with the audience and share where you are and what you're going with.
Oh, I'd love to do that. Thank you.
Awesome. And alchemists, as we wrap up our episode, I want to take a moment and share my appreciation for your listenership. You are the reason that we're here, and you're the inspiration for the show. I have a goal of impact, and I want to share that impact of great leadership, of great education, of great voices of every guest on our show with you. And you're the inspiration. And I hope our journey today sparks some points of interest for you. Again, to dive deeper, you can make sure that you subscribe to our monthly newsletter for scholarly insights, actionable strategies, and an in-depth analysis of each episode. Just reach out in our Instagram DMs for the link. And Chris, thank you so very much for taking time out of your schedule to connect, collaborate, and empower us all through your lived experiences.
Thank you, Tyler. It was a pleasure. First and foremost, you just used the word impact, and it sparked, a memory of a couple of things that I've been talking with our team with since I arrived here. It's purpose and impact, right? And I appreciate that you reached out, that you gave me this opportunity to reflect. And probably the most valuable piece of this is A, meeting a new colleague here in Alberta, and B, taking the time to reflect on the work, because I don't know that we have enough opportunity to do that. So it's been a great conversation. I've learned some things here too, and I appreciate the connect. Thank you very much. I'm grateful.
Thanks for sticking around to the end of the show. If you have feedback, a suggestion, or just want to start a conversation, fire off an email to me, tyler@elementaleducator.com. I actually read them. And if this episode sparked something, leave a review on Apple or Spotify. It helps more leaders find the show. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, where I put out additional content. I'll see you next time, same place.